Good morning, and thank you all for joining us for this webinar on strengthening our essential infrastructure workforce. I'm Meron Johannes. I'm BPC's Housing and Infrastructure Project Policy Analyst. And I will be moderating our discussion today on workforce and infrastructure developments as they pertain to the current COVID-19 crisis and beyond. While many of us have adhered to stay-at-home orders, social distancing, and work from home, essential infrastructure workers put themselves at great risk to keep our critical systems running. The crisis has put a spotlight on these workers and reminded us all how important they are to our public health and our economy. Today, we want to explore the vital role that they play in our economy, how we can better protect them through the crisis, and invest in them after these threats diminish. So joining me today are experts across the infrastructure sectors. First, we have Hope F. Cupid. She is the president and CEO of the Southeast Rural Community Assistance Project. Her organization provides training, technical assistance, and other resources to help rural and tribal communities across 7 states address water, community development needs, and housing needs. Next, we have Billy Terry. He serves as the director of the National Transit Institute at Rutgers University, which provides education, training programs for public transit workers. He has extensive experience in transit operation and policy, having worked for the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Next, we have Jason Walsh. He is the executive director of the Blue Green Alliance, where he advocates for a more sustainable economic future. Walsh has more than 20 years of experience in policy development and advocacy in a range of issues including climate, clean energy, and economic and workforce development. Let's pretend to give a virtual applause to everyone, as I know applause would have been here. And I just want to thank all of you for joining me today and speaking with us today. So for the audience, I have a few questions prepared, and I'm excited to get this going. For those of you tuning in, we will be taking audience questions towards the end. I encourage you to use the live chat function available to you, and we'll be addressing your submitted questions. You can also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive, or you can tweet us. Our Twitter handle is @BPC_bipartisan. So go ahead and get started. Hope, I'm going to start with you if that's okay. Can you each take a couple of minutes to explain your perspective and experiences of working on infrastructure workforce issues?
Yes, from my perspective, functioning critical infrastructure is imperative as it relates to water and wastewater home ownership and lending services. CERCAP is a member of the RCAP national network, and our network provides technical assistance and training throughout our service area. We want to ensure that we properly address infrastructure workforce issues because we've been dealing with those for so many years now. Our technical assistance providers work with small rural water systems. One workforce issue that we often see is a shortage of licensed operators. And this has become worse by several different dynamics in small rural areas, typically not experienced by larger communities. The one thing that we always see is declining populations. This leads not only to a lack of licensed utility operators, but also a shrinkage of the pool of qualified individuals to work in the field. We also see poor business practices. Many small utilities don't believe in raising rates. There's a difference between understanding what it costs to run a system versus what you need to actually get the revenue to operate a system. So that has caused some political, pain for some systems. So they're operating at a very reduced utility rate, which causes low wages for their staff. And let's talk about lower wages. So when a rural utility hires new workers and gets those folks hired up, it's very tempting to go work for a larger system that's going to pay you more because people have to take care of their families. So we need to make sure that we pay a wage where we can keep these folks, especially in the rural areas, tribal areas, and other marginalized areas that need water service. So at CERCAP, what we're doing to help workforce development and to help with that is we're working with Springport Partners to get a
Mhm.
pipeline of people out there to get into the water and wastewater field. We're hoping to attract people, especially young folks, to get them engaged. Thank you.
Thank you, Hope. How about you,
Thank you.
Billy?
Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I've been fortunate to have experience across a range of the sort of transportation diaspora. Now, I can see now transportation is very broad, but most
Mhm.
of my experience has been in the transit aspect of transportation. As you know, we have highway, maritime, aviation are all under the larger banner of transportation, but my experience has predominantly been in the transit industry, and in the transit industry, part of the challenge or the little known secret is there's a variety of workforce issues within the transit agency, large or small. I think when most people think about public transportation, clearly they think of the bus or the train and the operator, the wonderful men and women who drive that rolling stock, those buses and trains. But there are a host of other workforce development issues in addition to the operators. You certainly have the maintainers, the people who take care of the buses and the trains and the paratransit vehicles. But then you have people in the finance arena. You have lawyers. You have engineers who work on the track. So there's a wide variety of occupations and specialties within the transit arena. Like many other industries, we are seeing a silver tsunami. And so now where the transit industry is trying to communicate or has been trying to communicate that the transit industry is a viable industry for lawyers, for finance people. I also had the pleasure of working for the District of Columbia Department of Transportation, which is in many ways operates a little bit like a state DOT and a municipal department of transportation, responsible for parking meters and streets and alleys and trees in the public space. And then once again, you have a wide variety of workforce development issues, from arborists to paving and milling, um,
Mhm.
to planners. So a very, very wide variety of occupations when we think of infrastructure. Who would ever thought that an arborist is critical to infrastructure, right? But we know our trees in our public way are a part of infrastructure in many urban and non-urban areas. So I've been really fortunate to have an opportunity, mainly on the legislative and policy arena, but to work on a number of issues in transportation, again, particularly in transit. And so I really look forward to talking about how this COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the ability for transit agencies and state DOTs and municipalities who operate transit have been impacted.
Thank you, Billy. How about you, Jason?
Thanks, Marone, and good morning, everybody. So, a little bit of context: the Blue Green Alliance is a national partnership of 7 labor unions and 6 environmental organizations. Our guiding principle is that Americans don't have to choose between good jobs and a clean environment. They can have both, and they have to have both. The goal of our infrastructure work is consistent with that, and it's really twofold. We want to invest in building a more modern, resilient, and sustainable infrastructure that will also create high quality family sustaining jobs and result in public health and environmental benefits far, far into the future. This pandemic has highlighted just how inadequate, even dangerous, the current state of our infrastructure is, with too many Americans unable to rely on basic necessities like clean water when they need it most. Additionally, we've seen just how fragile the livelihoods of many workers are, too many of whom live paycheck to paycheck. And these two problems are interwoven, right? And should be addressed in tandem with smart investments and legislation that has strong standards embedded in it. So, with more than 40 million Americans filing for unemployment benefits, with an infrastructure system that consistently gets a D plus grade from the American Society for Civil Engineers, we should really be viewing public investment in infrastructure as an unparalleled driver for economic stimulus and job growth, which we badly need. And if that is done smartly, it can make this country cleaner and more resilient in the face of catastrophes like this pandemic or natural disasters, which are increasing in frequency and power due to climate change. And through a workforce lens, public investment in infrastructure can also be used to create on-ramps into construction careers and other careers and jobs, in particular for unemployed and disadvantaged workers. So there are well-recognized policy levers that enable this, from project labor agreements to community benefits, the local hiring, right? So that people who live in communities where infrastructure projects are developed can actually benefit directly from those projects. And then the utilization of pre-apprenticeship to apprenticeship program pathways, and certainly in the construction center, the best of those are registered apprenticeship programs that are jointly run by building trades unions and their signatory employers. So I'll stop there for now.
Well, we look forward to hearing more from you, Jason. Thank you, guys. So leading to my next question. So we talked about how there's diverse issues in the infrastructure workforce. We talked about inadequate infrastructure and investments. So I guess I just want to know, are these the same pressing challenges facing essential workers at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic? And are these going to be the same challenges as people are going, as you know, we're opening up our economy, going back to work? Or are there other challenges that we're not really familiar with that have been exacerbated since COVID-19? So I wanted to start with you, Billy, if that's okay.
I think that certainly, first of all, thank you. The challenge of enhancing the workforce of public transit workers, I think is ongoing. Certainly pre COVID-19, the inability to train and bring on new folks, even though this is a short period of time. Feels like forever, though, for these past few months. But I would imagine that we will still see challenges in training. Let me give you an example. My organization, the National Transit Institute, that's essentially what we do. We go across the country providing classroom-style training to transit agency staff, to state DOT workers, to staff of metropolitan planning organization on a wide variety of issues related to public transportation. I would imagine it will be some time before we can implement our full contingent of classroom style training across the country, given the pandemic. So I think the notion of training will has been and will continue to be an issue, even more so post the pandemic. I think the underfunding of providing transit service has always been an issue. Transit services is essentially a public a service, and it's a public service that requires subsidy, just like your garbage pickup, just like your fire and EMS services. And so funding it has always been a challenge. Pre-COVID-19 and certainly post-COVID-19. I do think the uniqueness of this pandemic that we're dealing with is impacts on ridership. Over the past several years, we have been seeing dips overall in the aggregate in public transportation, whether that be because people are moving into the inner cities. We see a lot of places that are doing commuting, again, pre-COVID-19. There have been a number of impacts on public transportation ridership, and certainly post the pandemic, our hope as an industry, we will gradually see people return back to public transportation. But again, we will be facing issues of protecting riders. We will be facing issues of protecting operators. We certainly will not be able to operate at full capacity on our buses and trains as we adhere to social distancing. So I would say that the funding issues, the training issues, and the ridership issues are certainly exacerbated by COVID-19, but were certainly issues that the industry was facing prior to COVID-19.
Thank you, Billy. Jason, same question for you.
So what I want to stress is that the actions we need to take as a country to reopen our economy and get it moving again are inseparable from the actions that we need to take to keep workers healthy and safe on the job. A leader of one of our labor partners, the Utility Workers Union, which represents workers among natural gas and power utilities, has likened going into people's homes to fix utility problems, which their members have done on a daily basis since this crisis started, as walking through a minefield. And tragically, many of them have stepped on mines. So 13 members of just this one union have died from COVID in the line of duty. So with states opening back up and more workers headed back to work, the problem's only going to get worse. The Trump administration, unfortunately, has made it clear that health and safety for essential workers is of a little concern to them. This is not conjecture on my part. It's clearly evident from the actions this administration has taken and not taken. Rather than issuing a temporary emergency standard, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration has issued voluntary guidance to employers for keeping their workers healthy in the face of this virus, which is non-enforceable by design. And instead of using the Defense Production Act as it should be used, which is to ensure that U.S. manufacturers produce the PPE that our frontline and essential workers need, this administration has instead used it to force workers back into unsafe conditions at meatpacking plants. Of the 25 counties in the U.S. with the highest number of confirmed cases of coronavirus per capita, 13 have outbreaks concentrated in meatpacking plants. So, to our minds, this issue of occupational worker health and safety is absolutely critical.
Thank you, Jason. Hope?
Wow. I mean, as I listen to Jason and Billy, I think about our own industry, the water and wastewater field, and oh my, all I could say is that the most pressing challenges facing essential workers is the fear of not knowing what to expect. There is a sense of uncertainty, among the workers and the possibility of getting exposed to the virus and then taking it home to your family and loved ones. That has to be a lot of stress. And we, employers, our government, we must acknowledge that workers' health and safety is first and foremost. We must ensure that we have access to personal protective equipment. And also we must educate workers on how to, properly navigate these new paid sick leave laws. These are new laws that were actually put in place to help them and to protect them, but we have to let them know their rights under those and allow them to use what is there available for them. A leading obstacle that I see, especially in the utility field, is the fact that workers are dealing with public perception. The public is constantly asking, is the water safe to drink? Well, yes, there are systems in place to make sure that the water is safe to drink. However, a real indicator on how, active or vibrant or if the virus is going down is what's in the wastewater. We have seen where that's an indicator of what's in the community. If you see more instances of it being present in the water, that lets you know what's happening in the community. If you see it going down, then you know that the cases are going down. But that they, in a sense, if they can be, research and test the wastewater to see what's happening, they could be like what you call a line of defense to signal the community about and aware us about and alert us about the potential of the virus spreading. And one last point that I want to mention, the workers in the in the water industry are eligible for retirement. I think Billy announced that, especially for his field. So there is an urgent need to hire, train, and retain younger and more diverse talent in this field. We need skilled workers as certified operators. And as people return to work and businesses reopen, the increase for the potential of the virus spreading is there and the exposure is there. So everyone must adhere or, to some degree of practicing social distancing and using the PPE to protect you. We want to protect all of our essential workers. So this is more critical to help us with the threat of COVID.
Thank you, Hope.
Thank you.
So you mentioned, Hope, about some paid leave policies, right? Which kind of wants to bring up something that we've all been seeing, right? CARES Act, what Congress has been passing to, protect workers, families, and all that. So from paid leave to hazard pay to new workplace regulations for social distancing, where has Congress, for all of you, where has Congress stepped up? Where has it fallen short in its attempt to respond to this crisis? And Jason, I hope you can answer this question first for me.
Thanks, Jason.
You're very welcome. So you mentioned the Bipartisan CARES Act, Marone, which was a good start. It provided badly needed support for workers by making some smart investments, right, to keep workers safe on the job and keep those who were left unemployed afloat a little bit longer. House Democrats took further action, as I think we all know, by passing the HEROES Act, which addressed many of the outstanding issues that we're seeing on the ground, right, including requiring OSHA to issue a temporary emergency standard, as I talked about earlier, fully utilizing the Defense Production Act to get workers the PPE they need to stay safe, expanding unemployment insurance and paid sick leave, and delivering critical support to local governments and schools, which are really hurting right now. There are still crucial pieces of the puzzle missing. So, for example, in the HEROES Act and the OSHA emergency standard, it did not include an analogous requirement for the Mine Safety and Health Administration, which covers all miners in this country who are among the most vulnerable to respiratory illnesses, given the kind of work that they do and given that so many of them are already suffering from black lung disease. Unfortunately, the Senate has not yet taken up the HEROES legislation. The Senate Majority Leader has said we need to wait and see how things go. To the extent he has shown an interest in any legislative response, it is attempting to shield companies from responsibility for exposing their workers to illness instead of trying to keep workers safe and investing in saving and creating jobs, which to our minds, even by the low standards of our current politics, is just deeply wrong. I think the biggest missing piece right now is that Congress, both chambers, still need to craft and pass economic stimulus legislation. We can both attend to immediate economic relief, but also start doing what we need to do for the medium and long term. And we need to start now. I mean, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that our economy will shrink by nearly $8 trillion as a consequence of this pandemic. So we need to see that kind of legislation pulled together. And as we've been talking about on this call, infrastructure is one of the best ways to stimulate the economy.
Thank you, Jason. Hope?
And I also know that Congress has stepped up in offering basic protections for people, impacted by this crisis. But much more needs to be done, especially for our workers that are the frontline workers. And one obvious shortfall is the lack of testing. There is a need to make sure we have adequate testing being conducted to stay ahead of this crisis. It has been really hard, especially for me, when I have 7 states and 1 or 2 states are declining in cases being reported, and then 3 or 4 are increasing. How do you manage that? How do you keep your workers safe and help the communities be safe as well? And another shortfall is access to health care during this crisis. This is still a major issue, and this should concern everyone. Because if you have an American citizen who doesn't have health care, but they still have to go to work, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to go to work, and then they're going to potentially get others sick. But if they had access to leave and sick leave and can stay home and get better, then that will have a better outcome. We also have the potential that if a person does get sick, especially in a small rural water plant where you have 2 or maybe 3 workers, if one person gets sick, then you're already reduced the workforce because you have to stay home for 14 days. So small communities and rural water utilities, they need additional support, not only for the short term to come, but the long term recovery. As Jason just stated, this is going to be a huge impact. They already had cash flow issues, and customers are not able to pay their utility bills. That's the major concern. And utilities were already operating on the bare minimum, even before this pandemic. So their revenue streams have also, further reduced. And I would like to see Congress help with that. We must pay these workers better. So we need to raise the rate so that we can pay our employees. And just let me say this: this current global health crisis is a reminder of how we are all interconnected. We all are, and how our collective health and well-being are thoroughly interdependent. So Congress has, fallen short on making sure all Americans have access to health care and economic relief, especially our low-income workers.
Thank you, Hope.
Thank
How
you.
about you, Billy?
Well, I certainly think that the CARES Act was a vital step in providing relief to the transit industry. The CARES Act offered the transit industry roughly $25 billion in assistance. That money is being allocated through existing programs, which I think definitely is a plus. You already have these existing channels where transit agencies are used to those programs, and that $25 billion will be funded through those existing programs. But I think some of the key points for the CARES Act in aiding the transit industry is providing operating costs. Typically, the Federal Transit Administration provides funding for transit agencies, but those monies are predominantly for capital costs. What the CARES Act does, it provides resources for transit agencies for operating costs. Distinct difference between operating costs and capital costs, and for the CARES Act to be able to provide large agencies, medium-sized agencies, small agencies, specifically with resources to help them with operating, the cost of fuel, the salaries of operators, et cetera, et cetera. And there's no limit as to how much a transit agency can use that CARES Act money for operating costs. Secondly, as was mentioned, those resources from the CARES Act will provide vital funding to provide PPE for transit workers, for the operators, for the mechanics, for road supervisors, people, frontline workers who come in contact with riders. So the utilization of those resources to purchase PPE is critical. Also, as it was also mentioned, that the monies from the CARES Act will allow transit agencies to pay the salaries of operations personnel on administrative leave. Right. So if you have to sit some people down, if someone has a presumptive or positive testing for COVID-19 and that person's out, CARES Act resources can pay those persons' salary. The other thing is that the CARES Act funding for transit entities is 100% federal share. Typically, Federal Transit Administration dollars are 80-20, in some instances 90-10, but this money is federal share, which means there's no local match. You can use all of those CARES Act resources for the PPE, administrative leave, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a number of transit agencies in an attempt to allow people to use their systems have waived fares. So there, in fact, is a loss of revenue. And again, CARES Act's money will allow transit agencies to supplement their revenues because of the loss of revenue, not only because of reduced ridership, but possibly for waiving fares. I don't have much commentary on the HEROES Act other than I certainly think that is additive to the great work that Congress has done with the CARES Act, but that's certainly in the midst of the legislative process. So I think that's sort of a bit of like, taking score at halftime. I think there's definitely much work to be done, not only in the Senate, but ultimately if the Senate passes legislation to see things come back in conference committee. I would encourage those who are interested in the impacts of the CARES Act and what the House has done with the HEROES Act to visit the website of the US DOT. There's a whole COVID-19 page. I would also encourage you to visit the website of the American Public Transportation Association and the Community Transit Association of America. Two trade associations for the transit agency has done a great job of informing the public and informing the transit industry about the impacts of COVID-19 and have some great summaries on both the CARES Act legislation and the HEROES Act legislation passed by the Senate.
Thank you, Billy. Really appreciate all that information. This kind of leads me to then my next question. So we talked about, Jason mentioned the Heroes Fund. We talked about with Hope some basic protections in place. I want to know, as Congress is weighing on, some highway reauthorization bills, Water Resource Development Act, there's been water assistance being discussed on the Hill, and of course, broader infrastructure stimulus bills. So going off what we were just talking about, what would you all like to see what would you like to see in the future in legislation to both protect workers through the crisis, but also, investing in building the new younger generation and skilled workers? And Hope, I would like to start with you, if that's okay.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Milan. I would like to see protection for workers through the crisis by, yes, definitely investing in building a pipeline of young, skilled workers. We need to ensure that these young workers have strong math and writing skills because we're seeing that as a challenge, especially in our line of work. So education is key. We also should assist or adopt a water rate protection program for struggling utilities and provide low-income ratepayer support, similar to the LIHEAP program that helps customers with their heating and home needs there. We also need to implement during this crisis guaranteed coverage of medical expenses, as I stated before, related to COVID. This should not expire in December. This is something that should be extended and maybe stay in place. Provide job protection for workers who fear returning to work. Many people are fearful of returning to work because they don't want to become vulnerable, especially who have underlying conditions. So we need to make those workers feel protected. The pipeline. Now, we don't really know the answer to this until issues like salary are addressed. We need to attract new workers. That would be difficult. People do not see the water and wastewater field as appealing. So we need to educate the public about why this job is important and working in this field. Maybe incorporating a water wastewater track in trades and technical education. I would like to see the high schools, offer trades again and also in community colleges, for those who are not pursuing 4-year degrees right away. And one thing that I would like to see are for all skill set programs, to be reintroduced in the school systems. One motivation for essential workers to adopt a program where older workers, are given an incentive to stay on longer and pass their knowledge to others who are willing to listen and learn. And I think that would be very important. And of course, financial investments are always key.
Thank you, Hope.
Thank you.
How about you, Billy?
I certainly would imagine that as we consider a new authorization bill, us in the transit industry shy away from calling it the highway bill. The new surface transportation authorization bills, we all know, expires this September. We are certainly on the clock. I would imagine that there will be some elements of the CARES Act and quite possibly the HEROES Act if that legislation ultimately is passed or some form of it. It's very controversial in the industry, the amount of federal funds that are used for operating. I think that Congress really had no choice but to allow for operating dollars to be used by transit agencies given the pandemic. But I think as a long-term strategy, that'll be interesting to see that there are many members of Congress who believe that the operating costs of transit agencies very much should be borne by the localities. And there are some of us who don't necessarily believe that, but that'll be interesting to see if that is an element that transfers from the CARES Act to a surface transportation authorization bill. again, the wider utilization of federal funds for operating. Certainly, we would love to see a heightened level of dollars overall for capital and operating. But one of the things that is critical is training. We have seen the House majority roll out its bill. It is called the Invest Act, which is their first volley of a new surface transportation authorization bill. I encourage people to take a look at it on the House T&I committee. Mr. DeFazio is the chairman. And one of the things that is in the Invest Act are increased funding for training. I want to be very careful because I don't want to have an infomercial here about my organization, but there is certainly continued funding for the National Transit Institute, who for some 29 years has been providing training on the administrative side of transit. But there's also resources to the tune of $12 million a year for a brand new program that's focused on frontline worker training. And Jason, I think you'll be proud to hear that many in the transit industry are very, very much environmentally focused. And one of the things that's happening in the transit industry is this shift to cleaner fuel rolling stock. Electric buses, hybrid buses. And so what that means is that we have to train a new generation of maintenance workers and technicians to adequately maintain those new buses. God bless that individual who works for the Chicago Transit Authority for 30 years as a mechanic working on diesel buses. Now, all of a sudden, that transit agency buys 100 electric buses. And how do we transition that worker to be able to service these newer technology vehicles? So certainly, I think increase operating and capital funding, we hope translates into a new surface transportation bill, and certainly increased funding for training. And then the very last point that I will make, it is critically important that our next surface transportation bill provide increased funding for research, particularly the Transportation Cooperative Research Program, TCRP, which I'm a part of, and I cannot stress how critical it is that the next bill funds the opportunity for research as we move transit into its next generation of service.
Thank you, Billy. Jason?
Let me just acknowledge what Billy said. We totally agree with you. Public transit is. Oh, sorry. Okay. Can you see me now? Sorry, I had to move to my daughter's bedroom, so I was trying to spare you the view of her stuffed animals. So I'm just kind of on a very professional role here throughout this entire webinar. So yes, public transit is, as far as we're concerned, is absolutely central to building a more sustainable, lower carbon economy. In terms of what more we'd like to see from Congress as it weighs these different pieces of infrastructure legislation, and I should be clear, the House in particular has done a good job of this so far, but we just want to make sure that as we rebuild our infrastructure, we are making sure that we're doing all that we can to make the jobs that are created high quality jobs, and to do that requires some intentionality, right? First, I'll just say we've got to protect workers' right to organize into unions, which we don't do a good enough job of in this country. We also have to ensure that any legislation includes strong procurement and labor standards. So by procurement, I mean standards like Buy American provisions, right, which ensure that infrastructure investments support American jobs throughout the supply chain, which makes total sense as policy and is very, very popular with both Republicans and Democrats. Arguably as important as making the investments in our infrastructure is how we can make them and what kind of jobs they create, right? And the way that infrastructure investments are made can significantly influence how they impact communities and the quality of the jobs that are supported, right? So I've mentioned a couple of policy levers at the top. I'll mention a few more. Prevailing wage provisions are critical, particularly in the construction sector. I mentioned local hire requirements. Project labor agreements are essentially master agreements on big construction projects between contractors and the different craft unions that actually build the work, and can have very concrete community benefits attached to those agreements. So that include developing a pipeline of workers, often from the local areas where these projects are being built, into not just the jobs doing the work, but into career jobs, right? And that's the pathway there is pretty well established: pre-apprenticeship to apprenticeship, and then on to journey person status. Those are the kind of provisions that we are working on, in addition to making sure that we're just making those investments, making sure that those investments result in the right kind of outcomes from a job quality and community benefit standpoint.
Thank you, Jason. I want to ask one more question.
Can I? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I just wanted to just make two quick points. I want to be strategic with my words here. I agree with you, Jason, that as a nation across all sectors, creating high quality, high paying jobs throughout our country is a priority. But I just would offer an addendum regarding Buy America as a lobbyist who was going on Capitol Hill, having conversations with our policymakers about Buy America. I would humbly assert that it is an incomplete conversation to talk about Buy America and enhancing domestic content if we are not simultaneously having the conversation about enhancing our domestic manufacturing footprint. Particularly as it relates to the production of rolling stock. For example, there's one heavy duty engine manufacturer in the United States. There's one, right? And so if we're going to begin to have the discussion, if we're going to continue discussion about enhancing Buy America, we have to have that simultaneous discussion about what we must do as a nation to enhance and bring back manufacturing in this country. Because the reality is that from a transit agency, when you have a very, very narrow choice of manufacturers, you either have to buy it overseas or increases the cost of whatever you're purchasing. So that's just one point that I wanted to make. And the second point that I wanted to make, there was a question about education in our infrastructure workforce, and that is in fact a challenge. I believe that my organization, NTI, and there are many other organizations who provide quote unquote training and education. Our sister agencies, the National Highway Institute, the Transportation Safety Institute, are wonderful organizations that provide training to transit, highway, and other transportation workers. But the notion of let's say a mid-level manager who has children and is a single parent, and they want to move up from mid-level management to senior level management, and they must do so when they're off the clock. That is in fact a challenge. I see many transit agencies across the country who are providing tuition reimbursement, flexible schedules, et cetera, et cetera. But I do believe that if we want to provide opportunities, particularly for women and minorities, to move up in the ranks of their particular agencies, transit and otherwise, that focus on education and allowing people to enhance themselves is critical.
Can I, as a point of order, enthusiastically accept Billy's friendly amendment to what I said about Buy American? And just to be clear to you, Billy, and to the audience, the only reason I'm not talking as much about manufacturing is because of the focus of this call. We do a ton of work on manufacturing. Billy's right. Buy American is not enough. We also have to be broadening and deepening our manufacturing base. Billy mentioned rolling stock. There are a bunch of areas where we need to be doing this. I think one of the very interesting lessons, I hope, from this disaster we're in the middle of is getting a pretty clear understanding of what it means to lose supply chains for vital materials and products, right? I mean, the disaster of not being able to procure personal protective equipment because, and having governors, you know, try to outbid each other to get an order from China is insane. And it has enormous human and economic consequences. So yes, investment in infrastructure, investment in retooling and rebuilding our manufacturing base go hand in hand.
Thank you, Billy, for raising that, and thank you, Jason, for accepting his amendment. Really, really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I do have one last question, and then I want to go to the audience, of course. So, Hope, I'll start with you. We've talked about how utilities are trying their best to, adhere to stay-at-home orders and social distancing, but at the same time, they have to do their jobs, and to do their jobs, they have to go out there, right? So, as we're hearing in the news, the new normal, right, including social distancing as folks are, as we're going back to work and opening our economy, how have public agencies and private utilities managing these liabilities for workers who contract COVID-19? Like, how have they been managing those liabilities? And do you think Congress needs to step in more or hasn't stepped in at all?
So for us, as far as managing the liabilities for staff who, have come in contact or have actually been exposed, we've asked all of our workers to to definitely, do not, number one, come to the office. But if they do come to the office, we also have asked them to, self quarantine to stop the spread. We don't want it to impact our operations, as if it's a major concern, we'll have to shut down and stop operating. That's not anything we want to do. So that's how we are managing it. We also, as far as the recruitment process, we have actually still hired people through this pandemic. Of course, all of that is online. We do that virtually. We offer all of our staff a kit, a PPE kit, that they can carry with them and keep in their offices. And we've also, as far as managing, kept communication plans put in place to let them know how to come back to work, how they're supposed to conduct themselves, and the proper procedures to follow to keep everything clean and disinfected and to keep the spread down. In our RCAP network, we do offer a lot of training. So I would say that for us going out into the general public, the rural areas, also to train the boards and utility managers about how to help their workers. There's a big think about whether you should wear a face covering or not, and we need to educate them on why that's important. That does help as we see the numbers decline. We see that it is important to practice the things that have been told us, have been communicated to us, especially from the CDC. As far as Congress, I don't believe they need to step in. They just need to provide, in my opinion, provide more guidance and have a clear, path for us as citizens to know what we're supposed to do and not send conflicting messages. And I think that's what's hurting the country as far as what we want to do, as far as how to protect ourselves. So when I say that, I think also we need to make sure that the items are affordable. We're seeing price gouging and people can't afford things, even to stay protected themselves. We can't find items. We've had to purchase items, and unfortunately, they've come from China, which we would like to buy local, but everything, as Jason and Billy stated, manufacturing something as simple as making a mask, something as simple as having alcohol and hand sanitizer. We're seeing all that stuff being shipped here from China, even for us. The other way what we're doing to help with the liability is to have people come into the office in staggering stages. That way, not everyone is in the office, and we're still offering, if you can, work from home. I think that helps as well. And we're learning now how working from home really does work. It's a lot of, well, you have to be in the office, but no, you can still work from home. We have shown that we can be productive and still keep everything running by working from home.
Thank you, Hope.
Thank
Billy, I want to
you.
go to you really quickly, and then Jason, and then we can go to our audience.
Repeat the question, Mara.
Yeah, sure. I just want to know how our public agencies and private utilities, so in your experience, transit, have been managing the liabilities for workers who contract COVID-19. And do you think Congress needs to step in when it comes to liability concerns?
Well, I think I don't know. Managing is an interesting verb. Certainly, a number of transit agencies across the country have are doing testing. There's certainly somewhat of a controversy about temperature taking. As we all know, that you could be non-symptomatic and still spread the virus. Certainly, transit agencies have implemented, to the best of their ability, social distancing methods within the workplace. There is a workplace for transit agency like bus yards, rail yards, other administrative facilities. And so I think they certainly have been doing their best. I do, as I sort of think out loud, when have this discussion about managing the liability of somebody using your service and potentially contracting the virus, whether they be a rider or a worker. I just think it's a much broader conversation that we have to have in this country. You know, somehow if you are in a restaurant and you contract it, is the restaurant liable? If you are, I mean, I think that we're dealing with something now that is historic in many ways, and that line between what we have to legislate and how we have to educate. Hope made the point about educating people about wearing masks or face coverings. And so I apologize. I'm giving you my lobbyist answer here simply because I think that this national dialogue that we have to have, you know, and you specifically used the word liability, right? Which I think is appropriate, but this notion of I am liable in the midst of this pandemic if you come to work. I am liable as a business owner. What if you come to renew your business license at City Hall, right? And you're waiting in line. And so I don't want to belabor the point, but I just think that we're at a place now where we are all vulnerable, right? And that vulnerability, does that vulnerability equal liability? And I think that that's a very broad discussion that we have to have as a nation. And then ultimately, does that discussion translate into legislation that says that you will be liable if someone contracts it in the course of consuming or participating in something that you sponsor as a business, as a public sector entity, et cetera, et cetera? I think that's a broad question that we still have to answer as a nation.
Thank you, Billy. What about you, Jason?
This is a hard topic to talk about briefly. So we have time for Q&A. Let me just briefly say that what I think is not an adequate solution is providing employers with legal immunity from workers who contract the virus because their employer is not letting them wash their hands or maintaining adequate social distance or developing protocols that protect them from infection. The proposals I've seen rest on this notion that as long as employers make a good faith effort, they should be immune legally, and that is deeply inadequate, particularly when a good faith effort is based on voluntary guidance, to go back to points I was making earlier that OSHA is putting out. If it were based on an actual standard that requires employers to develop infection control protocols, then it's a different conversation.
Thank you, Jason. All right, so we've had a ton of great discussions so far, and I think we have some audience questions. So Bruce Anderson asks on YouTube, is there any research that covers transportation and utility cooperatives and the compensation, safety, and employee retention experience?
Help, please.
I would just say that there are cooperatives, but not to the point where compensation is making any difference. That's more about access. And from what I've seen, I haven't seen anything about compensation. Compensation across the board has pretty much been pretty low on some instances. So I would like to see that improved. Billy?
No, I'm struggling a bit regarding the question. Is research that covers transportation and utility cooperatives and the compensation set. Wow, that's a lot in there. Um, Maybe I'm misinterpreting the question. I'll just briefly respond by saying that there is a tremendous of a partnership between transportation entities, mainly transit agencies and utility entities. As we see shifts to things like fuel cell buses, compressed natural gas buses, liquefied natural gas buses, electric buses, and those partnerships that have to be had with energy and utility providers. We see a number of best practices in those partnerships. And related to employee retention experience, I will sort of harken back to some of the innovative things that transit agencies are doing to provide education, on-the-job training, and to provide supplementary programs like mentoring programs, and then also tuition reimbursement, flexible schedules. If you think about it, if you give, and I would imagine this is the same across sectors, if you give someone an opportunity to advance in his or her a job and occupation and within their employer, I can't think of any stronger employee retention program is to give a person an opportunity to advance.
Billy. Jace, you want to take that one or want to go to the next question?
No, what they said.
Okay. Well, another question. Zach Valdez asks on YouTube, what is the role of traditional versus advanced manufacturing in strengthening our essential infrastructure workforce? Follow up, can you discuss the importance of childcare and education within essential infrastructure workforce frameworks?
These questions have a lot packed into them. And I think some of this depends on how you define traditional versus advanced manufacturing. Certainly, and I will defer to my colleagues here who are more practitioners than I am. Both require pretty significant skills training. I think in both traditional manufacturing and in advanced manufacturing, certainly you're seeing a far greater need for information technology skills. So, for CNC operators, a lot of this stuff is increasingly computer based. But beyond those comments, I don't have a lot to offer.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think? Oh, go ahead.
No, I would just say in general, I think manufacturing and just a number of even what we traditionally have been blue collar and something I like to call baby blue collar, right? A mix between white collar and blue collar. We see the necessity for technological skills. We see mechanics having to enter work orders on iPads. So I would just say in general, not necessarily manufacturing, but I just see a technological enhancement from people at all skill levels in order to perform his or her duties.
Thank you, Billy. How about you, Hope?
Manufacturing is not, what I deal with, but I will say just knowing that what we do need more manufacturing here in this country so that we can get what we need on time. I am very disappointed at the fact and knowing what this virus has brought to my attention is how dependent we are on other countries for things that we need, basic things that we need. So, and also with the importance of childcare, if you want to help folks who are, trying to increase their skill set and get a better job, or you need to provide that childcare, and that's something that also is just not there. We have to have that so that people can go back to school, increase their skill sets, and get a better job to take care of their family. A lot of that we see that's what is keeping people from, getting better opportunities.
Thank you, Hope. I know we still
And
have
for
questions.
I want to say something about employee retention. I'm sorry, about employee retention. Um, the thing about that is that when I see a lot of our small utilities, they get folks that come in and they train them, and then they leave for better paying jobs. So how can we, combat that as well? We You have to, in order to live in this country, unfortunately, it takes money. So we need to see how we can strengthen those systems to make sure that the workforce is protected there also.
Thank you, Hope.
Amen.
I know we still have audience questions, but I want to be cognizant of the time. So I'm just going to end with one question that I want to ask all of you, and I think will be really important for our audience. Are there any other lessons we should take away from this unprecedented crisis moving forward?
I would say from the transit industry, developing enhanced systems of cleaning our rolling stock and our workspace, something that we'll see going forward. Because I certainly believe that we'll all be in the cleaning and sanitizing mode for some time to come. But then, secondly, on the administrative side, where we see people working from home, we see the wonderful folks who work for Zoom and WebEx and MS Team being bombarded. God bless their customer service folks right now. But we'll also begin to see the ability for folks to work remotely on the administrative side, across all industries. So I think those are two things, probably not the most mind blowing things, but two things that we'll definitely see moving forward.
Thank you, Billy. I think you're
The
on
one thing
mute.
that I want to take away from this, just on a personal level, we're all in this together, and we must support our public health and welfare of everyone here. Utility workers are essential. When I go to Walmart, those folks are essential. We cannot look at people as servants. These are people that are helping us to just maintain our daily lives. So
Right.
that is what has brought out a lot of what COVID-19 has brought out to me. A new job. I'm very grateful for when I go to the grocery store, someone cleaning the carts. I never thought of that. So,
Yeah.
new jobs, new opportunities, new ways to protect ourselves. Let us don't overreact. Let us don't panic, and let us, thank all of our essential workers for keeping us safe.
Thank you, Hope.
I think for me, the biggest lesson and takeaway is that our economy and society wasn't working for too many Americans, and this crisis has made that clearer than ever. I mean, I've talked about how workers are living paycheck to paycheck. We haven't talked as much about the fact that this pandemic has shown how a virus, just like pollution, disproportionately impacts communities of color and low income folks. So, biggest takeaway from my vantage point is that it, just remaking the pre-COVID status quo isn't good enough, right? After all of this human tragedy and economic ruin, we should work toward coming out the other side of this crisis in a better place than when we went in.
Thank you, Jason. Well, that is our webinar today. Thank you, Hope, Billy, Jason. Thank you so much for sharing your insight with all of us today. And I really appreciate all of you taking the time out of your very busy lives to join me today. I also want to thank our audience for joining us as well. I know we went over a little bit, but you got some great information. I think it was worth it. I also want to I also want to recognize the questions that we didn't get to. Feel free to contact BPC, email us, call us, and we'll make sure that we can get your question answered. And I also want to thank the events team and our producer today for making us all look good.
Yes.
and and ensuring the broadcast would run smoothly today. So thank you guys so much. Really appreciate having this conversation with you all today, and I hope everyone has a wonderful, great day. And I look forward to continuing this discussion to support and better support our essential infrastructure workers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maron.